and I shall very briefly introduce them both. As many people will know, Phil is both Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and is well known for his many works on penal politics and sociology of punishment questions, but perhaps most celebratedly for the important book that he co-wrote with Josh Page and Michelle Phelps in 2017, Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle for Criminal Justice. And Katie is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, having previously worked at the universities of Toronto and Nottingham. And she specializes in the role of non-profit organizations in criminal justice, or as we might say in British English, in the voluntary sector, and community organizations and their effects in the variegation and contestation of forms of punishment. So welcome both. Today they're going to be giving their paper, which is a version of the paper that appeared recently online anyway, in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice, the Palimpsest of Outdoor Penal Labour. I did look up the definition of palimpsest, but I'm going to let them introduce it. Okay, guys, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, you should have dual control now. I'll just start.
Fabulous. Okay, so everyone can hear me, I hope. Awesome, thank you. So thank you so much, Richard, for that introduction. And thank you, Richard and Maximo, for inviting Katie and I to present at this workshop series, the Social Analysis of Penality Across Boundaries. Obviously, as folks know, co-sponsored by the Scottish Centre of Crime and Justice Research and the Crime and Society programs of the National University of the Littoral in Santa Fe. And indeed, as Richard has already said, and we were chatting at the beginning, what a pleasure to see both of them in the same Zoom box. Katie and I's talk today is a kind of mashup of a few different things. So fingers crossed it works. And if it doesn't, apologies, and you can let us know. It's titled Agonism, Palimpsests, and Thinking About Penal Change. Again, it's a kind of mashup of some of our work, some of which we've done together, and some of which each of us have done with colleagues who, of course, are not here presenting today. So between the two of us, Katie and I are going to speak for about 30 minutes, give or take, and that should leave, we hope, plenty of time for questions. So I can begin our joint presentation then by talking some about a book that Richard was kind enough to mention, published in 2017 with professors Michelle Phelps and Josh Page, both of whom are faculty at the University of Minnesota in the US. And then I'll pass the mic, so to speak, over to Katie, who is going to talk about the concept of palimpsests that she developed with two of our colleagues, Erica Canacini and Vanessa Evans. And then a bit about a paper, the one that Richard also mentioned, that is forthcoming in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice. And then I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about some evolving ideas on how the lessons of breaking the pendulum might be kind of updated or taken in new directions, given this ongoing work in palimpsestic penality. So it might be helpful then, we thought, to start with some of the central axioms of breaking the pendulum. So that book was born of a collective desire by Josh, me, and Michelle to think about what a mid-level theory of penal change in the US might look like. To do that, we leveraged Josh's previous important work that folks are probably familiar with on penal fields, and Michelle's excellent scholarship on rehabilitation, methods of comparative analysis, and other areas. And in the introduction chapter of the book, we present three central axioms that we then trace throughout the chapters by examining historical shifts in prisons and punishment in the US. So in those chapters, we make use of existing scholarship rather than doing original empirical research, namely state-level case studies of how punishment changed in various places at various times, some work done by people who are here today. So how punishment changed in New York or Florida or Texas during a particular historical period. So this book really is, perhaps all academic books are on some level, but this book is very materially held up, or is the result of our ability to use other people's really excellent scholarship. The first axiom of the book tries to capture the heart of what we mean by agonism, or that punishment is agonistic, which again, like palimpsests, at least for me, requires a bit of a dictionary. And agonistic is often defined as combative or straining for effect. The word is from, the etymology of the word is from the Greek athletic contest called agons, at public festivals, in which people were locked in a sort of combat or contest. So in recognizing the role of contest and struggle, Josh, Michelle, and I wanted to highlight the people and the groups that make up and shape penal change, the agonists. So our first axiom states, as you can see on the slide, penal development is the product of struggle between actors with different types and amounts of power. We apply this specifically to criminal justice, arguing that criminal justice throughout history is replete with struggle. In part, this is because punishment by definition demands that people succumb to coercive pressures. So that's true whether the state sentences a person to pay a fine, to go to treatment, or to serve a prison, jail, or probation sentence. It's arguably particularly evident inside prisons, where prisoners struggle to assert autonomy, to obtain goods and services, to have intimate relations and protest conditions of confinement. What's more than struggle and contestation in the criminal justice field consists of many different things at various times and places. So it includes, as people here today have studied, conventional political behavior, things like lobbying, knocking on doors for votes, coalition building, rallies, and so forth. But we all know that it involves other things too. It includes subversion, the refusal to implement or adhere to policies and programs, the refusal to implement mandates, the effort to do so in a way that perverts or rejects the original intent. Criminal justice struggle also consists of disruption. So this can be, for instance, when subordinate actors withdraw cooperation, when they refuse to follow the script and do their part. We also argue in the book that struggle can be symbolic struggle. So in the criminal justice arena, people struggle to shape ideas, collective representations, and sentiments about crime, punishment, and related issues. So because struggle takes so many different forms, and because it encompasses so many different strategies, it necessarily includes a diversity of actors. And this is what the second half of the axiom refers to, namely that the actors with different types and amounts of power. So put differently, because actors have different types and amounts of power, there's lots of struggle. And reciprocally, because there's lots of struggle, there are lots of different actors with different types and amounts of power. So because the people involved in penal change are not equally equipped to participate, and therefore to prevail in competitions, the penal game becomes tilted towards those with the most resources and the greatest desire to maintain the status quo. The benefits of the struggle then tend on average to go to incumbents, away from actors who have fewer resources, away from those who seek to reform or radically alter existing practices. So the exact type of resources that are most useful depend on the particular struggle. And that can take us then to our second axiom. Oops. There, oh, sorry about that. It builds directly on our first. So contestation over how and who to punish is constant. Consensus over penal orientations is illusory. So there's been some debate on this second axiom in a really helpful and productive way, I think, including a series of essays published in Law and Social Inquiry. And in Breaking the Pendulum, we argue that even in times when the penal landscape seems settled, that consensus is illusory. So even when there's not open warfare and one side appears to have won, opponents of the status quo continue their various efforts to shape public and political opinion. They do this in ways that favor their positions. This can be because subterranean or hidden struggle is critically but quietly shaping criminal justice regimes, perhaps in some cases paving the road for the next big penal pivot. And that takes us then to the third and final axiom. So we stated in the book as large-scale trends in the economy, politics, social sentiments, intergroup relations, demographics, and crime. They all affect, but they do not determine, struggles over punishment and ultimately penal outcomes. So in some ways, this third axiom is at the heart of what it means to do mid-level theorizing, we think. So that is, we're saying, yes, absolutely, large-scale trends matter. They affect, they condition, but they don't fully determine punishment and penal outcomes. Well, what does then? At the risk of being perhaps too simplistic, people do. So we know from scholarship by sociologists and other social scientists that people, of course, it goes without saying, construct social reality. And they do so within, of course, particular structural contexts. So, applying to criminal justice, objective conditions matter, and they impinge on individuals and groups. Applying to punishment in particular, macro-level theorists of punishment therefore have and continue to identify the structural factors that contribute greatly to the penal trends. But these conditions do not directly shape punishment. They're filtered through national, state, and local penal fields. And they're filtered through organizations and people that operate as kind of mini fields, as we'll see taken up and modified by the concept of palimpsests later in the talk. For now, note that events such as economic depression, heinous crimes, political shakeups, and so forth can and do often provide windows of opportunity. These are windows in which people, subordinate actors, can improve their position in the field. These events can also reinforce dominant actors' power. Either way, events shape, but fields and mini-fields matter. So a final image to leave you with before I turn it over to Katie. A final image that might be useful is one that we do draw on in the book and is featured in the cover there, which is plate tectonics. So we can imagine that large-scale trends as the kind of energy that causes the tectonic plates in the earth to rub up against each other. This then causes friction. Every once in a while, it even causes dramatic shifts, such as earthquakes. Along the way, the settling of the earth that's happening all the time is perhaps somewhat like we might see it as somewhat like the dominant orientation of criminal justice. So dominant orientations exist, but those orientations also hide fissures and building pressure. This is, again, very similar to a geological idea that geological fact that a lot is happening under the earth, and it's not always apparent on the surface. The reality of criminal justice regimes, then, is far more complex and differentiated than it may appear if you only looked to the dominant orientations, the incumbents at any particular time. Like the Earth's plates, then, criminal justice is never permanently settled. It's always changing, however subtly and slowly. And now I turn to Katie.
Thanks, Phil. So inspired by works such as Breaking the Pendulum, colleagues Erica Canacini, Vanessa and Evans and I wrote this book chapter appearing here on the slide using the fictional television series Black Mirror as a way to think about how we might understand and explain processes of penal change. In this chapter, we were especially interested in exploring the role of temporality in how penal change is narrativized. In other words, we were interested in how the past, present, and future as fluid, flexible, and nonlinear categories could be mobilized in order to tell particular stories about penal change. And to do this, we started thinking about penal change as akin to a palimpsest. Now, palimpsests are pieces of writing on which old text is continually removed or effaced to make room for new text. But in doing so, this leaves faint and uneven traces of what was there before, as is evident here on the picture represented on the slide. So a classic example is the Archimedes palimpsest, which is a 13th century book that was created by scraping off the original text, cutting the pages in half, rotating them, writing on top, and assembling the pages as a new book. In this case, as in all palimpsests, how we read the new text is informed by the faded presence of the old text underneath. But the process of combination, the scraping, the cutting, and the rotating of pages also alters the extent to which we can see the old text and decipher its meaning. Palimpsestic penality then not only takes seriously the role of history in informing contemporary punishment, as many other scholars also do, it also considers how contemporary understandings of punishment impact what we see or how we read, so to speak, past logics and practices. As such, the palimpsest metaphor allows us to understand how older beliefs and ideas about punishment can be selectively and creatively reimagined and revisited in light of new understandings. It allows room for penal logics to bleed and blur outside of a strictly linear understanding of time. In a forthcoming paper in a special issue of the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice on path dependence, co-edited by, I think, somebody in this room, Ashley Rubin, I think I saw here. So Phil and I extend these ideas about palimpsest, about using palimpsest to understand penal change by turning this premise on its head and asking if and how palimpsests might also help us to better understand penal stability. To do this, we mobilized some of the archival work that Phil did for his dissertation, looking at the history of outdoor penal labor in California, specifically highway and forestry camps. The primary data that we have on these camps is predominantly drawn from documents stored in the California State Archives in Sacramento. And our data includes an eclectic array of documents ranging from memos about camp policies and procedures, letters with community members near proposed and existing camps, internal communications among correctional officials, and reports written for various internal and external uses. In reading through and reanalyzing this data, we came across an empirical and conceptual puzzle. For much of the 20th century, approximately 5 to 20% of prisoners in California were put to work outdoors, building roads or fighting fires. Yet during this time, there were significant changes in how punishment in the Golden State was discussed and practiced. So we have rhetorical moves towards and then away from rehabilitation, tremendous variation and braiding of penal logics on the ground, and ongoing struggles over what punishment is and what it ought to be for. And so in this paper, we're seeking to offer an explanation for how and why outdoor penal labor was able to persist relatively unchanged in its practices over such a long period of time and across these differing, dynamic, and often contested understandings of punishment. And so to make sense of this, we extend emerging work on palimpsestic penality in dialogue with existing theories by historians of what is referred to as path dependence. So understandings of path dependence are useful at the broadest level because they acknowledge that history matters, and more specifically because they constellate around this idea of inertia, that taking steps in certain directions encourages further movement in the same direction as trajectories become entrenched and resistant to change. Two of these theorists, Mahoney and Thelen, have described how change in otherwise static systems occurs in 4 major ways: through displacement, layering, drift, and conversion. And now in our paper, we mobilized the first 2 of these mechanisms to describe the construction of palimpsests through these alternating processes of displacing and layering older with newer texts. And the second 2 mechanisms come into play when we consider that palimpsests are artifacts that are read or interpreted by individuals. For instance, drift allows us to account for the reality that when readers encounter palimpsests, they do so from distinct historical, social, and political vantage points that change the impact of the same text over time. And conversion allows us to account for how readers can exploit the inherent ambiguities of palimpsests. This combination of multiple overlapping texts means that there are many ways a palimpsest can be interpreted, depending on which parts are highlighted, by whom, and with what intention. So we'll now apply this framework to our archival data. And this figure is a summary of what we think this might look like. It traces our palimpsestic argument across 4 dimensions for highway and forestry camps. And let's start by looking more carefully at the first row of the figure. It distinguishes between types of labor. The purpose of highway camps was to build roads, whereas forestry camps were and are today concerned with preventing and fighting wildfires. As indicated by the dotted line, when forestry camps were introduced, they were layered alongside the waning presence of highway camps, displacing them entirely after 1974. The second row of this figure takes us further. While historical accounts of California's prison camps do some work in line with this first row, they don't really cover the second row of this figure. That is the continuity of practices across time and place. So whether building roads or fighting fires, the nature of work and life in these camps revolved around many of the same rhythms. This includes everything from the particular tools that prisoners used to the ability to have some greater freedoms than in walled prisons, and the inherent dangerousness and difficulty of this kind of work. In other words, what might seem very different, highway and forestry camps, were in fact linked across time and space. Taken together, these top two rows of the figure speak to the overarching continuities in outdoor penal labor in California throughout the 20th century. This is the curious stability we seek to explain. Now, when we look beneath the surface to the bottom two rows of the figure, we can see that this stability doesn't just magically happen. Harkening back to this idea of agonists, people make it happen. Indeed, much of our paper is concerned with documenting that and how there's a lot of things happening to maintain this apparent stability. For instance, the third row of the figure summarizes the ways in which penal administrators adapted the role and purpose of the camps to changing penal trends. Reminiscent of Mahoney and Thelon's conversion, skilled administrators were able to change how they spoke about outdoor penal labor over time. In doing so, they changed the way they framed the camps to support one purpose or another, variably highlighting the value of labor for labor's sake, positioning labor as a form of rehabilitation, or reinterpreting these practices through a lens of state obligation and calculated risks. These changing discourses of outdoor penal labor allowed penal administrators to be seen as keeping in line with the latest penal trends and with societal changes more generally. As a result, they could also keep the work and life in the camps relatively constant because they changed the framing. Put differently, distinct and shifting framings of outdoor penal labor worked to justify these practices' persistence amidst wider changes in punishment and the penal field. And finally, the fourth row, if I can get it to come up. Whoops, I think you might have moved the mouse. And finally, the fourth row represents the camps shifting positions within the penal field. Sometimes the camps were tightly coupled with larger trends in punishment, at other times only loosely. Recalling Mahoney and Thelon's drift, changing the coupling meant that nearly identical practices have at different times and in different camp settings been framed as emblematic of the reigning ideals of punishment, as problematically out of step with dominant thinking, and as curious outliers perhaps best ignored. The palimpsest metaphor helps us to see the stability of outdoor penal labor over time, and at the same time, it shows us the remarkable flexibility of this work as a conduit for a wide range of beliefs about and framings of punishment. The dynamic interaction between these two seemingly contradictory claims of stability and flexibility is the crux of the penal labor palimpsest. We see its discursive malleability in the hands of variously motivated penal administrators and how it has allowed the central patterns of labor and life in the camps to remain largely unchanged, even amidst these sweeping organizational, political, and societal changes. So putting this all together in this paper, we argue that while much previous scholarship has focused on the ways in which penal labor can be torturous, that is painful, our case study also uncovers the ways in which it was tortuous, full of surprising twists and turns. What emerged from our reanalysis of Phil's archival data was not a straightforward story of path dependence. It was not that the past was simply sticky, making change unlikely and putting inertia behind the status quo. Instead, we see outdoor penal labor in California as akin to a palimpsest. It's a blurry combination of practices, framings, and rhetorical justifications. These are assembled and interpreted by skilled and variously motivated penal administrators. Our analysis highlights the effort it takes to maintain penal practices and policies amidst a variegated and highly contested field. And finally, we see how the agency of penal administrators as the architects and interpreters of the penal labor palimpsest, how these served as a stabilizing mechanism, akin to, but distinct from, existing explanations of inertia, more commonly foregrounded in theories of path dependence. I'll now hand things back to Phil for some broader reflections and conclusions.
Okay, thank you so much, Katie. So again, I'll end our Katie and I's talk by thinking about how we might revisit the 4 lessons in the concluding chapter of Breaking the Pendulum in light of Katie, Vanessa, and Erica's really important work on palimpsests. The idea here is to offer some kind of very initial thoughts, provocations maybe, for us all to sort of collectively stew on, and we really look forward to questions and comments, therefore, to the audience, from the audience, pardon me. And on some level, hence the kind of tongue-in-cheek title, maybe this is really about a sort of rediscovery of postmodernism. So the first lesson, Breaking the Pendulum, in the conclusion chapter of the book, was to examine the spaces between. So that is the periods in which penal terrain appears settled. So in Breaking the Pendulum, we argued that this meant that we ought to try to complicate our understanding of the present, as well as, of course, to understand how and why penal change occurs. So in particular, paying attention to subordinate actors, to conflict between and among people and groups, and the periods that appear on the surface to be of settled consensus, but maybe aren't. But I think Katie and I are thinking about how, therefore, if we pivot to a kind of palimpsestic penality, we perhaps need to reframe this lesson. We need to think about how the past is sometimes, maybe it's even often or always, read in light of the present. So if the palimpsestic metaphor proves useful in other people's research on other times and places, maybe we need to do more than examine the places and spaces in between. Maybe it's that our read of those spaces itself is shaped always and necessarily by future events. Make this perhaps a little more concrete. It could be that whether actors are considered to be on the periphery, for instance, or the core, is actually difficult to measure, maybe even unmeasurable, unless you know something, hard to know, about the future. So maybe that affects that reading. So any effort, one could argue, therefore, to describe penality today in Canada or Argentina, for instance, could always be contingent. It could always tell us more, or at least as much, about how we view the past than the facts of today. Drawing on some recent work on weird temporality by Fiedler, Cananis, and Linneman, perhaps they are right to write, quote, "Time is scarcely as solid as it seems to be." So where could we take this in the future? Well, a question regarding this lesson that Katie and I want to leave you with is that of a penal zombie. So Josh, Michelle, and I did write a tiny bit about penal zombies in a maybe quirky way in an essay we wrote in that series that I mentioned earlier, published in Law and Social Inquiry, in which some colleagues very generously and thoughtfully engaged Breaking the Pendulum. To put this as a question in terms of Katie and I's talk today, when you're thinking about punishment and penal change, what are the afterlives of people and ideas? Do ideas ever really die, and are they ever really gone? The second lesson from Breaking the Pendulum was to map it out. Originally, by this, we meant examining penal policies, practices, and priorities as they played out in specific geographic contexts at particular historical moments. Again, we can revision this in light of a palimpsest, and we could rewrite the lesson as questioning what is a map in the first place. Perhaps when we make a map of a penal field of any particular place and time, we necessarily capture layers of the past and the present, of people's hopes, aspirations, and expectations of the future. Another way to put the same idea would be if the kind of mapping called for in Breaking the Pendulum is two-dimensional, the mapping inspired by a palimpsestic penality should probably be very much three-dimensional. Something to consider would be to think of a map, and I'm no physicist, so forgive me if I'm totally mangling this, but would be to think of a map, not unlike Schrodinger's cat thought experiment. You may remember it as I do from your high school physics courses. Again, why I'm likely mangling it, that was a few years ago. In very simple terms, the idea is to put a cat, with apologies to the cat, in a sealed box with a flask of poison that's either randomly shattered or not. So you don't know, of course, because the cat's in a box, whether the cat's alive or dead until you open the box. And there's entire branches of quantum physics that have all sorts of ideas about how before you open the box, the cat is actually both alive and dead simultaneously. Incidentally, Schrodinger and Einstein weren't very happy with that way of looking at things. They thought that might be impossible. But other physicists have certainly dug into this idea, to leaned into it, so to speak, and suggested that it's maybe there are many worlds going on in which the cat is indeed both alive and dead. But the key thing is that the cat state collides at some point with the observer state, and then indeed it becomes decidedly alive or decidedly dead. Okay, thought experiment aside, the question here is what takes place, as Katie was talking about a few moments ago, if we actually, not actually, I suppose, but if we take seriously the non-linearity of time. And if we do that, we think we have to ask what happens when we map a penal field. How does the very act of mapping change how we think about the past, the present, and the future? Also, if our mapping exercise is persuasive, it could, of course, have an effect on people's actions, on their own efforts to shape punishment moving forward. So social science mapping may be not entirely unlike observing the cat, and how we as researchers participate in the shaping of the very fields we sometimes claim to be objectively encountering. Many of our universities encourage us, in fact, to shape the fields that we map, or at least try to. The third lesson from Breaking the Pendulum was that we should keep the criminal justice in society. On this, we were trying to join a group of scholars studying punishment in society, arguing that economic, intergroup, political, cultural, and other social forces shape penal development. So again, developments that could seem outside the realm of criminal justice could provide opportunities for some actors while closing off or limiting possibilities for others. A palimpsestic penality would suggest a modification to this, namely that criminal justice and other fields are at least, at minimum, co-constitutive, to draw on a venerable law and society concept. So these fields then could be created and recreated over time by overlapping sets of actors who would pivot relative to one another, creating the blurring boundaries Katie was speaking of earlier. So again, to leave this as a question for perhaps other places to take it, the question could be whether when doing research, we could reverse the order of inquiry. In Breaking the Pendulum, for instance, we often sought to understand changes in probation, in parole, in prison, and we tried to understand those and change those in light, of how historians and other scholars had described changes in society at the time. What happens, however, if we work our way not from the inside out, but from the outside in, thinking about changes to society that have occurred during the past and present, and then asking what that would mean for our understanding of punishment today? Again, reading the past in light of the present. The final lesson of Breaking the Pendulum was to avoid fatalism. So we really, to be honest, mostly wanted to close the book on a less pessimistic note. And so we came up with this idea. The goal was to encourage scholars, practitioners, activists, and others to remain optimistic and to keep struggling. Focused on the US during the 21st century, for instance, American penal scholar David Green had cautioned, cautions, there is the danger that the very success and proliferation of harshness narratives have produced an orthodoxy about American punitiveness, and that hinders our ability to notice and appreciate developments in penal thinking and policy that run counter to it, end quote. So this can be a motivating and uplifting lesson. It can tell us about how the long struggle to transform punishment, although frustrating, can pay off. It could mean that fissures can splinter and expand and produce shockwaves across the penal field. It may almost never amount to a permanent and total shift from A to B, but struggles do matter, and small victories may well remain worth fighting for. So what would the palimpsestic penality teach us about this? A palimpsestic view of this could put a spin on it again, as with the others, and we might need to propose that how we read success and how we read failure, indeed how we understand change at all, how all of these things are contingent on how we read and understand the present. I warned you, it's rather postmodernist. This could also be not dissimilar from a kind of Foucauldian-inspired genealogy of the present, though. And in terms of where we might take this, following the other lessons, including the nonlinearity of time, perhaps success and failure are actually simultaneous and coexist. Again, a kind of provocation and something to think about. So Katie and I think I'll end there. And Katie and I are, I'm sure I'm speaking for both of us when I say really looking forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I guess I'll stop the